if you're taking the view that there are no stance independent moral facts, then it seems to follow that anyone who calls themselves a moral realist and claims they're getting outraged over what they perceive as your very immoral thoughts and ideas or whatever, however they characterize it. Like it seems like it would follow that they're not actually outraged over that because these facts don't actually exist. So what do you think they are reacting to when they see someone come in and say, I'm an anti-realist, and then they kind of respond with, these kind of implications that they kind of hold your feet to the fire over, it seems like.
Yeah, well, I don't think there have to be the facts for them to be responsive to them. They only have to have the
Mhm.
belief that there are the facts. So, if someone thinks that God is commanding them to do a thing and they got to do it, they're going to do it even if God doesn't exist or God didn't command it. So, if they think that anti-realism carries these terrible implications, that's all the motivation they need, provided that they care about whatever it is that they think is so bad about anti-realism. So that's all it really requires. Just that they think that my view has the terrible implications that they think that it has. In some cases, they're just going to think I'm wrong, and they might
Mhm.
be they might just be. So in some cases, it's just going to be polite, like, "Hey, I think you're mistaken." In other cases, people might dislike my confidence about anti-realism or some of the specific things that I say about it. So, a lot of realists might have no issue with an error theorist or non-cognitivist that is sort of playing the same analytic philosophical game with them. So they want to give this semantic analysis, the anti-realist gives a different semantic analysis, and then they hash it out as colleagues. But I'm not simply saying realism is a mistaken view. I claim that non-realist accounts of realism often rely on terms and concepts that are meaningless and unintelligible. And some people take umbrage to that. They find that insulting or offensive. So you're saying my view is literally nonsense? And my answer is yes. I think it's literally nonsense. People don't like that. So they get upset about that. I say, yep, my view has zero disadvantages. I have all the advantages. I said that. People think that that's absurd, or they'll say something like, nobody in the field takes your view on this matter. There's probably a couple people, but there's not a lot of people. So I take an extreme minority position that virtually nobody takes. I don't know of anybody that endorses metaethical indeterminacy that's publishing. I'm like the only one that I know of. So I have, like, when I say minority, I don't mean there's 3% of us. I mean, it's me. Like, I'm the person. And then I'm confident about it. And I think that can like match a general pattern that if a person endorses what people perceive as a fringe view and they're confident about it, that can set off red flags for people that this person might be unjustifiably overconfident. This person might be there's disparaging ways of describing a person like that. You could say, hey, Lance is a crackpot. This is a person that's super confident of it. Imagine like I was the only theoretical physicist defending this completely different view from like modified Newtonian dynamics or like general, like the standard models. And I'm like, I have the Lance model and I'm the only one. And I'm like, this is the best view. And like no physicists agree with me. A lot of people would react to that by going, yeah, that's not a person to take seriously. And so I think a lot of philosophers see themselves as being part of a collective with a certain degree of expertise on the matter. And I'm not a person without any training in philosophy, but I'm still representing views and attitudes with passion and enthusiasm and confidence that people think, well, no one endorses this view. What are your arguments for this view? And in a lot of cases, the problem is that I think that they often operate in a flawed model of a dialectical model of presenting these like goofy syllogisms. So like, I'm not going to give you like a syllogism for my view about language because I don't think it's the kind of thing that you could just articulate as a syllogism. Like it'd be a little weird to like present quantum mechanics or general relativity in terms of like simple syllogisms. So
Mhm.
yeah, I also disagree with him methodologically. I disagree on the dialectical norms of how to work out philosophical issues. I disagree on like the vast majority of the foundational issues and how we should even talk about these topics. And so I think some people might see that as a cop out. They see it as an evasion to doing what they think the proper methods, procedures, and steps are for engagement on these issues. But I think a lot of arguments and the positions that we take on these matters are not the sort of thing where you give someone, a PPC, premise, conclusion, like simple syllogism, and then they go, oh no, what do I do with that? I see that approach as like absurd. It's deeply ineffective. Typically, what happens is when you force everything into simple syllogisms, you compress and by necessity exclude all of the nuance and disambiguation that would be necessary to present a decent argument in the first place.
Mm.
And my approach to arguments is far more holistic. It's far more empirically grounded. For instance, what I would say is, look, I can't, if I think that the contemporary 5 metaethical positions that Humer describes as the only options are not the only options because of some fundamental issue, which is what I think. I think all of the positions rely on semantic theses. Well, I'm critical of semantics. I think it's basically pragmatics all the way down. So I have fundamentally different views on how language works. So how do I literally cannot frame my position in the conventional terms because the conventional terms rely on presuppositions about language that I reject. So what am I supposed to do? Give a syllogism for why I think languages use theories are correct? That's silly. This you would have to work out the empirics of this stuff. For instance, what I would have to do is say, hey, generally speaking, like universal grammar is wrong, Chomskyan accounts are wrong. The kind of account put forward by in like the language game by Christensen and Chater, that's a better approach to language. We would have to talk about like language cognition and language development. So there's like all this empirical stuff in the background for why I endorse the view about language that I endorse. Now, once you get all that down and you say, okay, yeah, this model probably does a better job of explaining language than this other model, like already most of like contemporary metaethics goes totally out the window because they all rely on these semantic theses. And those semantic theses, it's not that they're false, it's that they're so conceptually confused, it doesn't even make sense to talk about them as false. To me, the central disputes in contemporary analytic, metaethical, semantic disputes about the meaning of moral utterances, the method that they use is, it doesn't make any sense. Like, so what they do is, like the way that they'll dispute these matters is they take these sentences, right? Murder is wrong. And then they'll say that is a moral sentence. And now I'm going to analyze using my intuitions and my knowledge about language, what the sentence means. But I don't think I think sentences only obtain and acquire meaning in contexts of usage. And it's not actually the sentence that means anything. It's the speakers that mean things. So the slogan I go with is words don't mean things, people mean things. Language I see as a behavior that people use to convey what they mean. I don't even need to use language in print. Like if I wanted a cup of water, I could point at water, point at a cup and go like this and say, and point at you and then point at me. Like I could charades out much of what I want to communicate. And I adopt this view from the language game that verbal and written speech is just really sophisticated charades. It's a behavior. And like this doesn't have intrinsic meaning to point. It's a meaning, what it means is socially mediated by you and your brain and me and my brain and what I'm trying to do and your interpretation of what I'm trying to do and how we try to navigate and coordinate collective action. And that is how I see language. Language is a social behavior that humans develop to achieve their goals. And so because I view language that way, the whole idea of working out the meaning of quote unquote murder is wrong is nonsensical. Murder is wrong. I literally think it's not even a moral sentence. Moral sentences are, they only occur, you could say, in the wild. The only actual moral sentences are if we went out and we found people talking, like we went to a street corner and we saw 2 people at a coffee shop and one of them said, she did what? That's terrible. What an awful person. The other person's like, I don't think that was awful. I think it was totally justified for her to do that. That's a real moral discussion. And then the question is, what do those people mean? And the only facts about what they mean, I think, are facts about what they're trying to communicate, what the intended, it's not just what they're trying to communicate. There's also going to be facts about like the function and of what they're doing. Like, what are they doing independent of like their explicit conscious awareness of it? So there's going to be all these sorts of descriptive facts about what's going on in that situation. That's real moral speech. And if you wanted to understand real moral speech, I don't think it makes any sense to study isolated sentences like quote unquote murder is wrong, because they're occurring outside a context of usage. And because what those people mean means something in that context, when someone else in a different context uses moral language, they mean something else. And so different people mean different things. And that context, like what those people mean is determined by the context and by what they're trying to do with the language. So if you take a sentence outside of a context, there's no one trying to use it to do anything. So it couldn't possibly mean anything because what it means is what the person's trying to do with it. So if there's no person using it, it doesn't mean anything. So I think that philosophers analyzing these sentences, they're literally not actually analyzing moral language. The comparison I give, it would be, if you wanted to study tigers, right? You're some type of zoologist or biologist, and you want to study tiger behavior. Would you study a photo of a tiger, or would you think about tigers and then study that? If you wanted to understand the anatomy and physiology of a tiger, would you picture a tiger, draw it out, and that's the anatomy and physiology of a tiger? You might approximate a real tiger, but why wouldn't you study actual tigers? And wouldn't the nature of actual tigers be fixed by what tigers do and not by what you imagine that they do or what you think that they do? Now, philosophers might argue, well, my imaginings and thinking about how people use language is a reliable proxy. It's a good method for figuring out what they're actually doing. Well, one, I think that that's just not true. Two, I think we could show that it's not true. And three, why mediate everything through your own biased, parochial, singular intuitions? Analytic philosophers are dealing with these decontextualized sentences, and they for the most part, it's a very insular discipline. They don't set a lot of other fields. They mostly work this out with each other. And so part of my concern is a sociological and psychological one. I think philosophers that undergo training and thinking about philosophy develop increasingly idiosyncratic ways of thinking and speaking that separate them from everybody else. So it isn't just like someone that just saw a tiger or someone that lives in a place where there's a bunch of tigers and they see them and then they're trying to work out tigers from memory. This is like someone that saw tigers a few times and then became like a priest of tigers and worships tigers and builds tiger statues and thinks about tigers all day long and is really obsessed with them. And they move away and they start a cult of tigers, and then they just worship tigers for the next 20 years. And then you ask them about the nature of tigers. And now they're going to have all this made up nonsense about how tigers are actually angelic and they never do anything wrong. They're going to have all this made up stuff that has nothing to do with actual tigers. That's what I think philosophers are doing. I basically think contemporary analytic philosophy is a kind of weird cult of language, a weird cult of cultivating really bizarre views about language and only focusing on those, and then mistakenly thinking that you're thinking and speaking the way that non-philosophers are. And I don't think that they are.
The question that was coming up for me earlier was, how do you not get discouraged though? Like, how do you
I do
not
get discouraged.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Oh yeah, I'm constantly discouraged. Yeah. So I sort of wax and wane. There's days I just feel down or I'm exhausted. It's discouraging for me. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is if I'm taking all these outlier positions on things, I am very self-conscious of the fact that I could be catastrophically wrong about any of it. So although I'm reasonably confident that I'm right about much of what I'm saying, I know for a fact I must be wrong about some of it. There's no way I just got it right. There's just no way. I don't know enough, and I must be wrong about some of it. So I'm wary of that. I'm going to turn out to be wrong about stuff. I'm going to change my mind at some point. So there's that worries me. What am I going to be wrong about? And I hope I find out. But there's also just it's discouraging when I feel like much of analytic philosophy is like theology or like alchemy. Like I think it's barely a legitimate discipline. I think that philosophers have done a atrocious, like embarrassing job of figuring out what their own methods are and how they work. It's embarrassing. Philosophers don't want to adequately address it. There's not that much work on metaphilosophy or philosophical methods. What are intuitions? How do they work? Why do they work? When do they work? How do they work? What's the underlying cognitive psychology and breakdown of different types of intuitions? What is their epistemic status? How can they serve as evidence? Under what context? There's no good answers to this. There's a tiny literature of people arguing about this. No one agrees on anything, and everyone else ignores it. So philosophers, I think, for the most part, have no idea how philosophy works and don't particularly care how it works. And I know that's sweeping with a broad brush. There are philosophers that care and there are philosophers that work on it. But sociologically speaking, I think for the most part, they don't. And I think it's a case where I think they know there's a smell coming from the attic and they do not want to go up there and look because I think it would be very unflattering when they look to find out what's in there. So I think philosophy, sociologically speaking, is in a constant state of sweeping as much as it can under the rug. I think philosophers, many of them, I think, are aware that they're on shaky foundations, and I think that they don't want to examine too closely. This is a case where there's monsters all around them, and they just don't want to turn on the lights and look. And I want to shine a damn spotlight on all of it and start fighting off the monsters. There's stuff we could do with philosophy. We can make it useful. We can make it valuable. And there are sectors of philosophy that I think are so worth pursuing. There's so much philosophers can do. They have all these resources and tools and training, conceptual clarity, breaking down arguments, using formal logic with a precision, clarity, and rigor that people outside of it just can't, like they don't have the training to do it. Philosophy has so many resources and tools that it could deploy to useful endeavors, and many philosophers do. One example would be Dan Dennett. I think Dennett's work on consciousness is phenomenal. It's fantastic. It starts with this approach of saying, how do we break down this problem? How do we dissolve this problem? And you get a book like Consciousness Explained and the surrounding sort of corpus of Dennett's work. What is the reaction of many philosophers to Dennett? The reaction of many of them is, this is one of the stupidest, most ridiculous, most embarrassing and idiotic views anyone has ever come up with in philosophy. Dennett denies consciousness. So there are straw men, mischaracterizations, insults, ridicule, mockery. And this is coming from professional philosophers, that many of them have reacted to Dennett with scorn and ridicule. And I would say it's disgusting, but it's just embarrassing for them. It's embarrassing for them. The way in which illusionism has been disparaged in academic philosophy is embarrassing for the discipline, because their alternative, from my perspective, is basically, no, it's magic. So you see, to me, philosophy seems to be, many analytic philosophers, especially the more a prioristic, armchair, and rationalistically inclined, cling to what I see as a kind of cryptotheistic desire to have something magical and special. They want this special territory for philosophy to have. They want it to be autonomous. They want it to be this special discipline that the sciences can never touch. And I think they see the tides rising as all the sciences advance and progress, and they're on this ever tinier island. And I think that this recent resurgence in analytic philosophy's insistence on like this revival of non-naturalist moral realism is a reaction to that awareness. And, philosophers will scoff and say, people have heralded the death of philosophy for thousands of years and it hasn't died yet. Well, it hasn't died until it does. And, I don't know that it will die, but I think that we will see, at the very least, massive paradigmatic changes. So philosophers, it's like they have a short memory. Analytic philosophy is recent. So this current approach that they're using, which to me is overly narrow, overly homogenous, overly focused on language, overly focused on goofy approaches to metaphysics, that has a limited lifespan. And it will be on its way out in the next few decades. Does that mean I think like academic philosophy or Western philosophy is going to go away? Of course not. But we will have new movements. I mean, look, 100 years ago, anti-realism was very likely the most popular position. You will find in papers from the 1980s from philosophers working in analytic traditions remarks like, well, I know everybody's an anti-realist, but I'm a realist and I'm going to make a case for it. So you see remarks like that. So it looked like that. We don't have statistics from the time, but the general tenor was anti-realism was ascendant up until like the mid to like 3/4 of the way through the 20th century. And so realism is seeing a resurgence. So I don't even know if that addresses your question. Oh, right. The discouragement. Yeah. I think I sometimes come off as being really animated and happy about stuff, but I remember I was teaching this class and I was asking my students, like, what drives you? What motivates you? What gets you up in the morning? And I was asking them, I got some answers. And I remember I gave an answer that came from the heart. I just gave the answer that came out of my unconscious. And the answer was anger. I'm motivated by anger. You could tell, like, I might seem enthusiastic. I'm pissed off about this stuff. It pisses me off the way that a lot of analytic philosophers posture and preen about the discipline. A lot of it seems like philosophy has this attitude, like we're just better than other disciplines. And so there's a kind of an aura of smugness around the entire discipline that I find gross. Like I want to take a shower after I deal with philosophy in a way that I often don't get from other disciplines. And that's a bad persona. And I think it drives people away. And I think people can detect it. And I think philosophers are continuing to perpetuate it. And people are rightly annoyed by philosophers acting that way. This is a discipline that is one of the least useful disciplines of any in the world. And it's one of the most pompous about its role. Philosophers will say it's the queen of the sciences. It's not the monarch of anything. It's the monarch of wasting people's time, maybe. So that's not a good thing, and it is discouraging. But the other thing I'll say, in part because I'm motivated by anger, is I was discouraged at many points in my academic career from continuing in philosophy. I've had people tell me, why are you even in the field? If you disagree with the field so much, why don't you just go do something else? I don't even understand why you study this if you hate it so much. So I think for a lot of people, I think a lot of people are unconsciously driven to push people out that don't fit in. That's just a natural human drive. And I think a lot of people do it. And I think people were channeling that when they said these sorts of things to me. If you don't want to be part of our club, why don't you leave? And I don't know what it is about me, but maybe it's a bit paradoxical, but I'm kind of like an oh yeah, I'll show you vampire. Like I feed on that energy. Oh, you want me to leave? I'm gonna stay extra long and I'm gonna, you know, sit in the corner and bother you because, you know, I don't like what they're doing. And all the discouragement just makes me go, oh, you know, it's the same thing like if someone says, hey, don't open that closet. Don't open. Now you totally want to open it, right? And that's how I feel about a lot of philosophy. It's like they're telling to me that, hey, why don't you just leave if you don't like it? For me, it's like someone saying, don't open that. I don't want you to see what's inside. And so I'm going to continue and I'm going to look inside and I'm going to show everybody what's in there. And I think it's a bunch of crap for the most part.
Have you always been that way, or is this something that you kind of cultivated over time?
Pretty much from the outset. Yeah. I was, as far back as I recall, I had a kind of, what? That's ridiculous kind of reaction to a lot of stuff. So I remember taking intro courses and not having the intuitions that I was told that people have. And I felt social pressure from the people around me to have those intuitions. Oh, come on, you really don't have that intuition? Oh, yes, you do. You're just saying you don't have that intuition because you think it's edgy. You know, I had people basically try to browbeat and bully me into speaking and thinking in terms of the way contemporary analytic philosophers conventionally speak. Philosophers go around saying they have all these intuitions about things. The psychological provenance of that is really bizarre. I don't think most people, like when they're working in other areas, like intuit the truth in the way that and I'm not trying to say that they see it as mystical, but it sure seems to function that way a lot of the time. And they make assumptions about what sorts of things are intuitive. So here's one case where I'm very different from many anti-realists. Many anti-realists would say, look, I find moral realism intuitive, but I reject it even though it's intuitive. I never found realism intuitive. I don't recall ever thinking that. And I've sometimes received backlash about that because philosophers will say this really goofy stuff. Philosophers are really, really terrible, sloppy, and lacking in rigor when they say stuff like, this is intuitive or counterintuitive. This is the common sense view. This is the plausible view. Plausible to who? Intuitive to who? They don't specify who. And when you don't share what they take to be the default intuition, they often respond with discomfort and in some cases hostility and in some cases disbelief. I routinely have people tell me that I'm being disingenuous or lying about lacking certain sorts of intuitions. And some have even suggested that I have brain damage. Like they'll actually say there's something wrong with your brain if you don't have my intuitions. And they'll cite this data. Like, so the data you mentioned earlier, I'll mention that quickly. Well, I'm not quick about anything, but whatever, too bad. So the Phil paper, you referenced the Phil paper's 2020 survey, right? That's the Bourget and Chalmers paper.
Yep.
And like it's this online survey. You could go to the Phil paper site and you could see that there's this online survey. Anyway, so they sent that out to a bunch of philosophers, about half of them in the United States, the other half from different parts of the world. It's kind of skewed towards you could say like the Anglophone world. Now, and it's mostly analytic philosophers. And we didn't talk about the analytic continental divide, whatever, that's a whole other thing. Anyway, so that survey, which 2020 survey, has 62% of philosophers endorsing moral realism and about 26% endorsing anti-realism. The remainder endorse like other, and then that gets subdivided into a bunch of categories. Philosophers get picky if you don't give them a bunch of options, which fair enough, fine.
Is that where you would fall in the other category?
No, I would pick anti-realism.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, some people might dispute that my position's an anti-realist view, but whatever. I mean, if the categories were precise enough, I could end up in the other position. So if it said something like this is a pseudo problem or quietist, I might pick that. So it's possible if it was framed like very carefully, but it's not. And that's okay. It's framed well enough. The survey. So like I care a lot about survey design. These survey questions are actually not bad. So you have about 2/3 endorsing realism and about 1/4 endorsing anti-realism. First, that's a little misleading. Part of the reason that's misleading is because realism, remember I mentioned that there's the naturalists and the non-naturalists. It's actually about evenly split between them. There's a very slight preponderance of naturalist realists over non-naturalist realists. Now, I don't actually think the naturalist realist views are necessarily wrong. I don't really have a big issue with those. And those views, in certain respects, they have more affinity with and much more in common with anti-realist positions than they do with non-naturalist realism. So it's somewhat misleading to frame it in terms of realism versus anti-realism because the naturalist realist positions are often so different from the non-naturalist positions. The naturalist positions are going to remove the things that I think don't make sense, like irreducible normativity and external reasons. They're going to remove this, in many cases, this like notion that morality has practical oomph or authority to dictate what kinds of actions we ought to engage in. It might even just outright just reduce moral facts to certain types of descriptive facts, which I would be totally okay with. There are construals of naturalism where I'd say, yeah, I'm a naturalist realist. That's fine. So I don't have an allergy to moral realism. My problem is with non-naturalist realism. And if you look at the breakdown there's another question that breaks down the specific types of metaethical position, you get 26.6% non-naturalist realists. You get 26.1% anti-realists. That's not that big of a difference. So non-naturalists are not, and so non-naturalists will often present like our view is the majority. Yeah, if you lump naturalists in, but why would you? So the situation is much closer to rock, paper, scissors, approximately evenly split with naturalism at the top, then non-naturalism, and then just barely behind it, anti-realism. That's the actual breakdown. And that's assuming that we don't have people picking realism for reasons unrelated to like maybe they don't quite know exactly how metaethicists construe it. The thing is, though, if you control and filter out everybody except metaethicists, the realist number actually bumps up to 65%. So it's actually a little higher. So that's not going to help me here. So yeah, you really do have more people endorsing some type of realist position over anti-realism, but it's a little misleading the way it's framed. Even so, even if you break it down into three, anti-realists are still only a quarter of the views, and there's still less than either naturalism or non-naturalism alone. So it's still a minority view. So the other thing to say about that is that many realists, here's just one example. I have a blog series, it's like 9 blog posts, and I call this the fill papers fallacy. And the fill papers fallacy is the fallacy of relying too much on the results of the survey to make claims about what people ought to believe or not believe. So if most professional philosophers endorse a view, sure, that's evidence for a view, but it's not very good evidence. And the whole thing is an argument for why. But here's one point of consideration. If you look at philosophers in general, do you happen to know whether most philosophers responding to the survey are atheists or theists? Do you know?
Responding to the moral
Question about
realism
whether they
survey?
believe in God. To the Phil paper survey. Do most believe in God or not believe in God?
As far as I know, I'm not sure if that was one of the questions they studied as part of it.
Yeah, it was. So they did ask people, are they theists or atheists? And
Okay.
about 70%, I believe, chose atheism. So most of them don't believe in God. But what do you think happens when you filter to philosophy of religion? It
Probably,
inverts.
yeah.
It becomes 70% do believe in God. It flips around. Now, what if someone said, well, hey, most specialists in philosophy of religion believe in God, so that's really good evidence that God exists? That's well, hold up a second. Because the presumption here, it would be like if you start from a neutral position and then you, in an impartial way, evaluate the arguments for and against God, and over 2/3 of people end up believing in God. Yeah, that's actually pretty good evidence that the arguments for the existence of God are solid. But the question to ask is, okay, what was the proportion of people that believed in God when they started studying philosophy of religion? And the answer to that is it might actually have gone down a bit. So, in other words, let's say all the people that end up specializing in philosophy of religion, it starts out at 90%. And then after they get their PhDs in philosophy and they start publishing in philosophy of religion, and then they answer the survey, it dropped down to 70%. Okay, so studying philosophy of religion apparently caused a reduction from 90% to 70%. So is that good evidence for theism? It's not so clear. Now, a lot of realists will argue the vast majority of ordinary people are moral realists. So if it turns out less than 2/3 of philosophers are moral realists, then does training in philosophy cause nearly 40% of people to stop endorsing realism? Because if so, how is that good evidence for realism? I mean, it could just be that even though there's still a slight majority, it's a slight majority that has failed to fully correct for a massive bias in favor of realism. So what we really need to know is the underlying cause of the expert belief. Is it caused by the quality of the arguments, or is it caused by because if in other words, if we started at 100% and went down to 62%, why would it be good evidence that training in philosophy makes you a realist? It'd actually be evidence against it. So philosophers are like, they just look at the raw number and they don't even think about what's the cause here, what's actually causing people to be realists or anti-realists, and that's the answer we need to know. So that is a sort of core problem behind this. There's selection effects, like people that are more disposed towards realism are probably studying the topics anyway. And then even when they do, you have to consider the causal direction of basically what is philosophy doing to people's views to move them up or down the dial. And no one considers that. So the raw number is just not that important.
I mean, I think that's probably a big problem with just how people treat statistics in general, right? Not really looking closely at, the data behind the number. I mean, a lot of that probably has something to do with the way, like, a lot of these surveys get published. Like, they're published in, an NBC article that's basically reporting that a study exists. How many people click on the actual link that takes you to the study and read the data is anyone's guess. I would imagine it's probably not that many people. So that might be part of the issue with just, the way people treat statistics anyway. But it something that I was wondering is, and it might sound like a weird question, but, like, what is the difference between a philosopher and a non-philosopher in terms of the way that they are thinking about these things?
In terms of how they're thinking about philosophy or just in general?
Well, in terms of how they're thinking about, yeah, like philosophy. Or do you think that non-philosophers are walking around thinking about, like, because my view is, and I mean, it's possible I could be biased because I have a degree in philosophy, so I've spent a bit of time thinking about it, and maybe I go out in the world and I see conversations people have who don't have a formal education in philosophy, and I think, it's interesting. A lot of non-philosopher, non-philosophically trained people seem to have a lot of the same concerns that philosophers that I study in school have, but they use different terms to talk about them. I'm wondering how you feel about that, if you feel like that's actually not an accurate description. Like, is it the case that people are talking and thinking about philosophical problems in their own language? Or is it the case that people are not thinking and talking about these philosophical problems at all? And we, the philosophers, are just inventing these problems, to kind of shadow box with and keep our discipline alive.
Yeah, so I do think people talk about issues that it would be reasonable to say that they're bumping up against philosophical considerations, like standardly conceived. So yeah, sure, people talk about philosophy in everyday contexts. I don't know how much. If we wanted to know, it would be a really difficult empirical question. You would need to, like, do things where people keep recorders on themselves, and then we would need to go over it, look at the proportion of times that, we would need some good operationalization of what a philosophical topic is or philosophical discourse is, and then we would have to see, like, what percentage of everyday discourse is about that. Even if the number is low, like it was 2%, I would consider that quite a lot. Like, if people talked about philosophy 2% of the time, that's not nothing. So I think the number would be lower than that. But yeah, I think philosophy, you know, I want to use this term, but it doesn't sound nice. Is like parasitic on everyday considerations. It's I think I use the term piggybacks on those considerations. So yeah, people I think engage in philosophy, but again, empirical question. Um, I think that philosophers, what they end up doing is, once they start considering these issues, at least in the analytic tradition, there's a tendency to create categorical distinctions and then try to ratchet everything we think, say, and do in accordance with those categorical distinctions. And once any given area, like subdiscipline, has a set of categories or a set of concerns or distinctions that characterize it, those become entrenched, and it becomes like a sort of sociological bit of history that becomes how philosophers frame that particular philosophical issue. And I think when people start studying philosophy formally, they are inducted into thinking in terms of those categories and distinctions, and they tend to project that onto their interactions and observations about other people. So if you're trained in philosophy, the central linchpin in metaethics concerns this realism anti-realism dispute. And when I think if you were trained to think in terms of that dispute, when you go out and you look at everyday language, I think you're sort of hyper focused, and you're primed to see realism and anti-realism out there in the wild, and that sort of blinds you to all the other things that are going on either instead of that or in place of that. And so when people, you might get a philosopher that's like, yeah, everybody I interact with tends to have this realist or anti-realist view. I think that they're not appreciating. And look, if you're an anthropologist and you're trying to study some particular culture or group or society, and you invest, like, you start asking people, why are you doing it this way? Or you start telling them, hey, there's two reasons why you could be doing this way, or reason A and reason B. Which are you doing it for? Reason A or reason B? Philosophers do that kind of thing all the time. they have their categories and distinctions. They even explicitly verbally present them to people, asking them to pick one, and then they just presume everybody is an A or everybody is a B. And two things. One, they don't have, like, it could be that the people weren't any of those things before you asked. And when you ask them, they end up picking one. They might become, like, start endorsing A or B because you explained it to them. I call that spontaneous theorizing. So I think philosophers are not realizing that if you interact with the people that you're dealing with, you can actually sort of corrupt the data that you're working with and see what you want to see in that data. Gathering real data about human behavior is a lot more, it requires a lot more care than I think philosophers appreciate, because they're typically not trained in the empirical sciences. So there's that. The other is people could pick stuff to be polite, and then they go about, like, hey, do you endorse the Copenhagen or many worlds interpretation? Look, if someone says Copenhagen, it's not like when they go to the rest of their life that's figuring into their speech and behavior. They were just answering you to answer you. So it doesn't mean that they are serious about it. So you could have that problem, basically superficial, like you're giving them a forced choice. They're picking something and it's not the real sincere answer. So that's another problem. And then the third is that when you're so focused on that dispute, you can overlook other features of the discourse of what they're doing that are the sort of raw actual stuff that's there. And so the problem isn't that philosophers are necessarily and always inventing problems, but they often invent categories, distinctions, and problems that I think are not present in everyday thought and discourse, or the framing of them is skewed or distorted. There are some examples of things I think are genuinely not a part of everyday thought. I'll give two examples. One are phenomenal states or qualia. I don't think ordinary people think, speak, or talk as though there are these intrinsic, private, ineffable, non-relational properties to our experiences. I don't think people speak or think in those terms. And I think efforts to try to find out if people have a folk notion of qualia are, first of all, what research has been done generally says, nope, it doesn't look like it. And I think it's because there's nothing to measure in the first place. It's just not a feature of how they think or speak. Another example, and this might be more controversial, is free will. I don't think ordinary people have thoughts about free will. I think free will is a philosophical term of art that Western philosophers made up. I don't think it figures into ordinary thought speech. I think people do think about agency, intentionality, moral responsibility, all those sorts of things. But I think that they are fragmented and disparate, and they operate semi-autonomously from one another. And I think philosophers have artificially bundled all of that into this sort of a conceptual chimera that does not reflect the way ordinary people think. And again, I think the empirical literature bears that out. So there's a couple examples.
Do you had mentioned the analytic continental divide, and I definitely don't think we want to either just want to go down that rabbit hole. But do you read continental philosophy at all? Like, do you like Foucault, Deleuze, Kierkegaard, all those other
No, not
crazy
really.
characters?
No. Yeah, I mean, it depends what you're going to count as continental philosophy, but I'm generally speaking not a huge fan. And often for the reasons analytic philosophers would cite, obscurantism, lack of systematicity, lack of formal argumentation, that stuff bothers me. Some of it is good literature, and I also think some of them are insightful and thoughtful and have good ideas. But and this is just as much, maybe not just as much, but it's partially my fault. I don't have the patience for a lot of it. Just don't have the patience for it. Get to your damn point. Tell me what your argument is. Now, I could say I think some of that has bled over into analytic philosophy too, where analytic philosophers, primp and preen and present themselves as being all formal and rigorous and to the point. But I often think that they just hide their own obscurantism behind a sort of a smokescreen of empty formalism, syllogisms where you don't need it. A lot of philosophers will say, suppose you had a person P who did event Q, and they love to just throw in the Latin. Suppose you have a person phi that did a thing omega or whatever. It's just completely unnecessary. Just say, suppose you have a person that went to the bank and they got money out of the ATM or something. Like you could just give a real example. You don't have to use formalism, but analytic philosophers love to do it. So anyway, yeah, I'm not into a lot of continental philosophy. Not really.
Is that something that empty formalism, is that something that you think causes like widens the divide between philosophers and laypersons, like when we
Oh,
try to talk?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think a lot of people have an inchoate sense that how you go about developing your views on a matter, what will persuade you, what will convince you, is something that's more holistic, foundational, and it's more about, like, hey, you've got this worldview where you have all these foundations, and then there's stuff built on top of that and stuff built on top of that. If you want to move me and you're hitting at something at the extremities, you're going to have to move the foundation in some way. Because if we're not sharing the same framework, then we're not going to reach any sort of agreement on this matter. And yet, a lot of philosophers will present formal syllogisms that do operate at the extremity and in a way where they're not even touching on the underlying issue. And the only way to adjudicate that argument would be to get at the underlying issue. One example came from a recent paper I read on consciousness where the argument is something like people experience pain. If illusionism is true, no one experiences pain. So wait, is that exactly? Can I pull up the argument?
Mhm.
Okay, here it is. Okay. Premise 1, people sometimes feel pain. Premise 2, if illusionism is true, no one feels pain. Conclusion, illusionism is false. Now, the problem with that, it's a problem that I point out, and it's this sort of trick with language. So the way that this argument works is that it's ambiguous about what's meant by people sometimes feel pain. Now, if you disambiguate it and you're an illusionist, you're going to either find the first premise false or the second premise false. Here's why. The first premise, people sometimes feel pain. Okay, well, what is illusionism? Well, illusionism is the view that there are no phenomenal states, but people mistakenly think that there are. So if you take premise 2, if illusionism is true, no one feels pain. Well, the fact that people mistakenly think they feel pain is irrelevant to the argument. So what really matters is that illusionism is denying that there's phenomenal states. Now, if you say people sometimes feel pain, are you referring to a phenomenal state or not? If you're referring to a phenomenal state, then the first premise, people sometimes feel pain, would mean something like roughly people sometimes, it would just be like there are some phenomenal states. And if illusionism just is the view that there's no phenomenal states, dialectically, this argument is ridiculous. It's like saying there are phenomenal states. If there are no phenomenal states, then there would be no phenomenal states. So there are phenomenal states. Or it's like not true that there are no phenomenal states. That could be your conclusion. That's ridiculous. It's just question begging. Alternatively, if the argument is resolved in a way where you don't require that pain is cashed out in terms of it being phenomenal pain, let's say it's functional pain. So people sometimes feel functional pain. Then you get to the second premise. If illusionism is true, no one feels functional pain. Now that premise is false because an illusionist would be totally fine with functional pain. They're just denying that there's phenomenal states. And so it's trivial for an illusionist to reject either the first premise or the second premise, so long as you properly disambiguate the claim. And this goes back to all of the things I've talked about, empty formalism, how you actually need to get at the foundations of what we're talking about here. And yet, this is the way that philosophers will demand that people argue. Give me your syllogism. What is your argument? And they want you to do stuff like this. And the only way to unpack this stuff is to disambiguate the language. And then once you disambiguate the language, you would have to explore why you support the particular premise you support. Why do you think people have phenomenal states? And then you have to get into the underlying meta philosophy or methodology. A person might say, well, I think I have direct phenomenal, like I endorse this view that we have access to certain facts about our phenomenology, and I think I have access to qualia. Okay, well, is that true? So then you have to get into questions about human psychology and cognition and epistemology. And now you're doing all the philosophy. And so basically, what was it? Carl Sagan had this remark, like if you want to bake a blueberry pie, you first have to invent the universe, something like that. I think you encounter a similar issue in philosophy, which is if you want to convince me of an argument like this, you first have to, invent an entire philosophical framework from the bottom up. And those philosophical frameworks would bury all of it. And we only look at this stuff at the tippy edge. And what a lot of philosophers do is they rely on rhetoric and framing to make rival positions or the proponents of those positions look stupid or bad. And that is how they argue. Look at what they chose here. People sometimes feel pain. Why not people sometimes see red? Why load it up with feel pain? Well, it's obvious why. If you think illusionism, like Dennett's view, is a stupid and bad position, and you think its proponents, like me, are stupid and bad, then you say, look at people like Lance. Look at this idiot and this jerk. Lance says people don't even feel pain. One, that's ridiculous. And two, that's evil. So Lance has no problem if you torture people, if you kick puppies, you could just punch your grandma in the face. That's what Lance is committed to if he's an illusionist. That is how this argument actually gets any traction at all, by falsely implying I'm some kind of stupid, moron, bad person. And this is what a lot of analytic philosophers do. They bury the rhetoric in formalism and act like they're doing something substantive, and they're not.
Do you think we should move away from formalism or try to make our formalisms better?
No, there's no problem with the formalism. formalism has an absolutely essential role in philosophy. This is one reason I'm not a huge fan of continental philosophy's aversion to it. The
Hmm.
purpose of formalism, though, is for me largely a matter of clarification and disambiguation. Now, sometimes it's actually bad for disambiguation because you're simplifying things, but clarification. If you want to see the structure of what I'm trying to convince you of, formalizing it is a great way to show. Here's the line of reasoning that I'm using. Here is the formal inference patterns that I'm employing to arrive at my conclusions. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But the problem with that is that there's no problem with that. That is its role. Its role is clarification. Here is what I'm trying to say to you. The problem is when people use it as a dialectical cudgel. What they will do is it's really like if I have to argue for my entire philosophical view, that could take hours. Like I literally can't do it. You would have to get to know me, and we'd have to have numerous conversations to really start to see my worldview and where I'm coming from. But so if someone says, "Oh my God, that's an unreasonable investment," I agree. I'm not expecting anybody to agree with me because I don't really think that people change their minds, philosophically speaking, by just like these quick arguments. They really is by people spending time and talking and getting to know people. It's a whole worldview shift. Everything is connected to everything else. All our views are in a holistic, interconnected web. And if you want to just pull a few things out of the web, it's just not going to work because you're just going to disrupt the whole network. We need entire network changes. And those happen, it's not just by intellectual stuff and reasoning. A lot of this is going to be emotional, it's going to be social, and that is unavoidable. We are human beings, and that sort of stuff matters to us. And trying to extricate ourselves from that and be purely intellectual, one, we will inevitably fail. And two, I don't see why would we want to do that. Why? I don't even want to do that. I want to be socially embedded. I like being a human. I'm not a truth optimizer. I'm a goal optimizer. So all that being said, formalism has that role. But what philosophers will do is instead of saying, "Hey, to really understand my worldview," I did encounter someone that had objections to me giving a response that I think people took as glib and kind of obnoxious, which is, "What's your argument?" And I said, like, what would I have to read to understand your worldview? And I said, everything on my blog and all of my writing. And that can sound like a jerk move because I'm saying, "Hey, jump through 1,000 hoops to really understand me." But it's the same thing like if someone says, "What do I need to do to get to know you?" Because understanding my view is understanding me. And it's
Mm.
understanding the interconnected way in which I've arrived at my views. They didn't emerge from the ether. So that wasn't flippant. I wasn't trying to be rude. I was saying, look, if you actually want to understand me, it would take a lot of work. I don't expect you to do it. And I'm not going around saying everyone has to agree with my views in metaethics or the state of philosophy. I don't expect them to. And if they don't, I totally understand. I just don't have that expectation. So again, I'm trying to get to my own point and I'm stopping myself. Philosophers will, you don't have to do any of that if I could just give you a syllogism, if I could just say premise one, premise two, conclusion. And what that does is, and it's something I absolutely hate about what philosophers do. And often non-philosophers are even worse with this in like the online Discord spaces. It's a keep the ball in the other person's court strategy. What the purpose of the syllogism is I give you a syllogism, now it's your job to show me what's wrong with it. And what the point is
Yes.
no matter what they do, you always put them on the defensive. A great way to never have to change your mind or be proven wrong or look stupid is to always keep your opponent on the defensive. You will find a lot of Christian apologists do this. Is, I go up to an apologist and I say, "Why should I believe in God? Why should I think Jesus was resurrected?" They might not say, "Here's why." Some do. Lots of apologists are great and fun to talk to, and I love talking to them. But a lot of them will say, they'll immediately start drilling down to your worldview. How do you explain the Big Bang? How do you explain evolution? "Oh, you can't explain it? Then I'm right. Ha ha ha." As it like, and it's a totally legitimate thing to say, "I have no idea. I just want to know why you think Jesus was resurrected." And then they don't even tell you. It's just, "What is your worldview? What is your worldview?" And the moment you can't answer, it's aha. So you don't even know your own view. So it's the same thing that philosophers do with formalism, is they use it to just constantly say, "The burden's on you, the burden's on you, the burden's on you." And it's like they think it's a game of hot potato. And when you have a syllogism, it's really easy to smack the potato back, right? You could just, "No, I don't have it. It's yours." No matter what you do, they just keep putting it back to you. Now, if you actually
Yeah.
have to explain everything you think, you wouldn't be in that position. So basically, formalism is great, but analytic philosophers and non-philosophers abuse and misuse formalism for rhetorical and like personal purposes that I think are really messed up.
Yeah, I've gotten into a habit of having to tell people sometimes that I don't do it's like a game of 20 questions. I'm like, I can't do that, you know, and I mean, one of the things that at least I struggle with sometimes is like it's not always easy to tell when someone is using a rhetorical tactic, when someone is just bad at articulating their ideas, and when someone is actually maybe even doing I've had instances where I've gotten into arguments with people because I think they're doing something, and then I get to know them, and I'm like, "Actually, we think very, very similarly," you know? And so a lot of times it's hard to tell sometimes where, you know, unless you can get in somebody else's head, it's hard to even prove definitively that, you know, you're, I don't know, engaging in good faith or engaging in bad faith or something. It's how do you it's you know, it's something that, you know, I've even set up rules on certain servers where I moderate where I'm like, I don't wanna hear about people being accused of bad faith. If you accuse someone of bad faith, just stop talking to them and stop bothering me, please. Like, because I can't be the arbitrator of who's good faith and who's bad faith all day long.
Well, part of it I think we're not going to be able to resolve. And that's somewhat pessimistic. It doesn't mean I don't think things can improve, but part of the reason is just that I think that there's more at stake and there's more underlying objectives to what people are doing when they're engaged in philosophical discussions in the first place. It's not as if when people go into discussions, they're just trying to figure out what's true. People have social objectives. They want to look smart and very much do not want to look stupid. They want to look like good people and not like bad people. They want to be impressive or appealing. They have social goals and they're trying to signal a lot. So people also encounter cognitive dissonance. If facing up to some consideration or fact would make them have to go, oh, you might be right about that, or oh, I guess I was wrong. That's painful. It's painful. I've been in situations where I knew that there was something seriously wrong with what I said, and I continued to defend it anyway, because it would be too embarrassing for me to stop and go, whoa, 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 wait. You know what? You're making a good point. I'm wrong. I retract that remark. I pushed ahead anyway. And I pushed ahead anyway for no good, for the reason was preserving my sense of not, I didn't want to feel embarrassed and feel stupid. And I didn't want to look stupid and have other people think I was stupid. I do that. I know that I've done that. And I suspect other people do it too. So you're not going to eliminate that. People are going to always want to look good and smart and not look stupid and evil. So that's always going to be a factor here. And that is going to prompt them to say things like, you're being disingenuous or whatever, insult a person or, you know, mischaracterize people's views under circumstances where they encounter a cognitive dissonance or they would have to face up to the fact that they would admit that they were being stupid or wrong about something. So you're gonna have that problem. But you can have institutions and norms that are sort of, you can saturate an environment with them enough that they do change people's behavior. And one of these is kind of like what you mentioned. I have a very close to no tolerance for people on my own server or especially in interactions with me, telling me that I'm being disingenuous or lying when I'm not. Because, you know, I have access to what's in here. And so when someone tells me I'm lying about my views on metaethics, they don't know the history of what I've been through thinking about and encountering and working through this sort of stuff. I know I'm not lying. So when you tell me I'm lying, like what, I mean, one, what's the point in having a discussion? Because
Exactly.
if, especially at the outset of a discussion, you feel perfectly comfortable just saying that the things I'm saying, I don't actually mean them, you could always pull that card at any point. And we
Mhm.
can no longer have a productive discussion if you do it. So one, the moment you tell me I'm being disingenuous or lying, no productive discussion can ever happen with you. So you have destroyed all trust in the conversation. Two, it's just so obnoxious to do that, to accuse someone with zero evidence. You just don't like what they're saying. Of people use the terms disingenuous, misrepresent, bad faith. They use this, oh, you're operating in bad faith. Another people call everybody grifters all the time. So like you know, they'll depict someone as if the person is just trying to get money and the person is like just disagreeing with you. As so what I think to do with that is I think that we need strong norms of saying it's not appropriate to make those accusations unless you have concrete evidence. Presume good faith unless you have compelling evidence. So here would be good evidence that I was lying to someone. That person says, hey, your friend has a private text exchange with you where you said, ha ha ha, I'm going to lie to this idiot and trick them by saying I believe this. Okay, now you got evidence I'm lying
Mhm.
because like I said that I was going to lie. That's evidence. If you show me that and say, yeah, you're lying, here's the evidence, that's totally fine. But accusing someone of bad faith with no evidence would be like in the middle of a conversation if I said, hey, you stole my lunch money, or hey, you're trying to hack into my computer. It'd be ridiculous. You don't know. How would you know that? And yet people do this all the time. They just presume bad faith. Part of the reason I think people do it is because in some cases they can't imagine that you disagree with them so much. So you must be lying. And it's so weird. So another thing, and again, I don't know how trainable a lot of this is just to get people to appreciate that humans are different from one another. Like people respond with total incredulity, disbelief, or even like an almost aggression at, like, for instance, people with like aphantasia or something like that. So if someone says, yeah, I don't have mental imagery, people will go, yes, you do. Of course you do. You know, it's ridiculous. How you're going to dictate what someone else's phenomenology is like? I mean, that's
Mhm.
it's comical for people to behave that way, and yet they do anyway. And even philosophers, like professional philosophers, will do this. They'll say no one thinks that, or you can't think that, or you must think that. Sometimes in philosophy, it's downstream of what I think are the bad methods and presuppositions. So some philosophers might say really goofy things like a person necessarily believes all the logical entailments of whatever propositional claim they endorse. So if you believe X and Y is entailed by X, you must believe Y. Now, it'd be one thing to say, like, as a matter of like a normative consideration or a logical consideration, if you're committed to X, logically, you would be committed to Y if you wanted to be consistent logically. Fine. Like
Yeah.
it's like trivially true. But it'd be another to mix that up with presuming as a matter of psychological fact, if X entails Y and you believe X, as a matter of fact, you do endorse Y. And so if you say you don't believe Y, you're lying. I mean, what is the assumption here? That humans are incapable of having logically inconsistent thoughts? That's ridiculous. Of course they do. So, like, philosophers will sometimes project that the norms of the discipline onto human psychology from the armchair, as though people's thinking must conform with their views about language or logic or metaphysics or whatever. And then they will stubbornly insist if you say, no, I know you think A entails B, and I said I believe A. I do not believe B. So stop telling me what I believe. I've had philosophers say, no, you do believe B. They'll just tell me what I believe. And that crosses a line for me. Don't tell me what I believe. That's ridiculous. And then if I say I don't believe it, they'll tell me I'm lying. Or I believe it, but I don't realize I believe it. Or something like this is really silly stuff. So part of it is just bad philosophy, and then part of it is human objectives, and then part of it is the absence of well-enforced norms. So if you have a community where you tell other people that they're operating in bad faith, hey, and you like say the kinds of things I'm saying, some people might go, you know what, you're right. I'm going to stop accusing people of that. And then some people will leave. And if they
Mhm.
can't control themselves and they think everybody's a big liar, they have some personal issues to work out. Maybe they shouldn't be part of these conversations.
You talked about the question of trainability of these things. And earlier you had talked about one of the problems with philosophy is that philosophers today don't really look to other disciplines for help.
What was the term that I came up with for this? There was a term, um, like I can't remember the term. Anyway, I had this idea that because philosophers tend, at least analytic philosophers, tend to be so inundated with this distinctive homogenous Western canon of like the same group of like British and American philosophers and a few German philosophers. It's like this really specific, culturally and demographically homogenous group of people and thinkers, and they're all trained on that same corpus. Now there are efforts to start changing that and to broaden the canon to include people outside the sort of traditional training, and that's great. Um, but it's not just what we read; it's where we are, who we are, what we live, what kind of life experiences that we've had, and so much of analytic philosophy, it's so bizarre because like take the dispute about knowledge, right? So much of the standard dispute about what knowledge is centers on like the use of the English word knowledge, as if our thinking about the matter should be exclusively determined by what? By how English speakers use a word? How do we know that other cultures have like whatever cognate, if they even have a cognate, is used with like exactly the same underlying principles and conditions? Now, maybe it is, but you wouldn't know that by thinking about English. you so but so like philosophers just focus so much on like the English language and reading the specific thing. My thinking is it would do philosophers a lot of good to have broad cultural exposure, to go around the world and to meet people from different communities. And I don't mean to go to academic conferences all around the world and talk to other philosophers. I mean
Hmm.
actually interact with human beings that are not philosophers, that speak different languages and have different cultural backgrounds and come from different demographic groups. Um,
Hmm.
I suspect that exposure would be eye-opening for a lot of philosophers. There's disparaging terms people say about people that never get outside and do anything, but you know, if you hole up in an armchair all day, I really think it makes you end up wildly out of touch with humanity. I
Hmm.
actually don't even think this is exclusive just to philosophers. There's something profoundly strange about how disconnected psychologists, because that's like my other main area of training, how disconnected psychologists often are from everyday human interaction. You bring people into a lab or you have people fill out surveys online. You're not looking at real human behavior by real human beings. You're looking at clicks on a screen. You're looking at what a person does in a totally artificial habitat. And that would be like trying to understand, you know, like wild animals by putting them in a box and then watching them and then saying, well, oh, look, the animal just stands around. That I guess these animals just stand around. This would be totally absurd. And yet we do that with people and then try to make inferences about how they act outside of the box. I mean, you can, but you got to be careful about it. And I think psychologists are particularly careful about it. When you bring up things like ecological validity or external validity, a lot of times they're rather dismissive, or they'll say, oh, it's super important. And then they go back to doing their online surveys and saying this is how all humans are. Um, so yeah, people that want to study other people, I think they don't realize what kind of work they're getting into, what they're asking to do. People are complicated, they're a mess, they're chaotic, and it's not like studying rocks or chairs or tables, or the sun or whatever. All of the natural phenomena in the world have the challenges. Like, astronomers have figured out how to figure out like the composition of things that you can't even go there and sample some from it directly, but they could figure it out. They face their distinctive set of challenges. If you want to study what people are like and how people think and what people do, you're dealing with chaotic, messy, highly diverse, culturally contingent beings, and you need to keep all of that in mind when you study them. And people don't, and it's regrettable.